Why Christians Don't Need to Go to Church. A comic produced by Richard Jacobson, unchurching.com. Printed in Australia by Bruce Kurtzer, simplechurch.com.au. What if we're doing church all wrong? Did you know, right now, millions of Christians are choosing not to go to church anymore? Especially younger generations like millennials. But surprising, a lot of them are still holding on to their faith. They still love Jesus and they still want Christian community. They just don't want to go to church anymore. But why not? Isn't church a place where you learn about Jesus, meet Jesus and worship Jesus? Why would anyone who wants to follow Jesus not want to go to church? Well, the answer depends on what exactly you think church is. If you go by church signs, then you might assume a church is just a building. However, if you go by tax exempt forms and bank loans, then you know the church is legally considered an organisation. But if you look at the main thing church goers do, which is come together every Sunday to sing songs and listen to sermons, then it's pretty clear church is actually a weekly event. Or maybe the church is all three. After all, today's churchgoers certainly talk about the church as if it's a building, an organisation and an event.
Look at that beautiful old wooden church.
What church do you go to?
What time does church start?
Do you notice a common theme? In each case, the church is something separate from us. That's an interesting contrast to the biblical depiction of the church, which is simply a spiritual family. Of course, it's not like we deny the verses that talk about the church as a family. We just add some of our own ideas into the mix. As proof, let's take a look at Jesus and what he said about church. Or more importantly, what he didn't say about church.
And upon this rock I shall build my church. So, see you next Sunday.
Most notably how, in all four Gospels, Jesus never told a single person to go to church. And keep in mind, Jesus is the founder of the church. This whole church thing was his idea. Yet not only did he not go around telling people to go to church, he barely talked about the church at all. In fact, in all four Gospels, Jesus only mentioned the church twice. Why is that? Well, whatever the reason, it can't be that church wasn't important. The church was extremely important to Jesus. In fact, the Bible tells us plainly that he actually died for the church. Not just for you or me, but for the church. So why did he barely talk about the church? And why didn't he tell anyone about the importance of going to church? Maybe he never told anyone to go to church because the phrase "go to church" would have sounded like complete nonsense to Jesus. I mean, the concept of going to church only makes sense as long as we believe the church is something separate from us.
What time does church start?
What church do you go to?
Look at that beautiful old wooden church.
But if the church is truly a spiritual family, then the idea of going to church starts to break down pretty quickly. After all, you never say things like,
What time does family start?
What family do you go to?
Look at that beautiful old wooden family.
but wait a minute, wasn't the church formed after Christ's crucifixion and resurrection? Maybe Jesus never told anyone to go to church simply because there was no church yet. But if that's the reason, then why did Jesus bother to teach us about how to handle conflicts in the church? If he didn't expect pre-church people to understand a simple instruction like go to church.
If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church.
Then why would he expect them to understand this teaching? Not to mention, this theory doesn't explain the matter of the Great Commission. Just think about it. When Jesus sent his disciples into the world, did he tell them to go start churches? No, he simply told them to make more disciples. And to teach those new disciples how to follow Jesus. I mean, if churches are things that have to be started and run, why didn't Jesus give his disciples instructions for how to start a church or run a church? It's almost as if he believed church community would happen organically, as a natural byproduct of simply teaching folks how to follow him. If so, that means discipleship is the root and the church community is the fruit. But that's the exact opposite of the way we approach church today. Today we start by building churches, with the intention of eventually creating disciples, thereby making our current form of church the root and the discipleship the eventual fruit, hopefully. But does this form of church facilitate genuine discipleship? Or does it inadvertently blur the line between actual discipleship and organisational membership? For instance, do we now measure obedience by mere attendance? And if so, how do we reconcile that with the New Testament? In the Old Testament, in order to worship God, people had to go to a special place known as a temple and enlist the aid of a special person known as a priest. But Christ's sacrifice turned all that on its head. God's people are his new temple, and every believer is now a priest.
1 Corinthians 6:19, 1 Peter 2:9.
But wait a minute. If we don't need to go to a special building anymore, and there aren't separate priests anymore, then are we saying Christians don't really need to get together anymore? Certainly not. In fact, it's just the opposite. Rediscovering our identity as the church and reclaiming our calling as the priesthood of all believers shouldn't cause us to experience less church community, but more. Not having to go to a special building means no longer having to wait until next week to worship. Not having to rely on a single priest means every believer can minister and be ministered to at any time. In fact, that's exactly what Paul spoke of when he wrote,
Whenever believers get together, each one should have a hymn or a word of instruction.
the church experience described in the New Testament wasn't the spectator sport we think of whenever we hear the word church now. That's why the New Testament has over 50 one another's. Instruct one another, encourage one another, love one another, and 47 more plus. Okay, so what do you do if you're done with today's institutional form of church? And you're looking for a simple church community that functions more like an extended spiritual family. Well, if you're still part of an institutional church, you might consider sticking it out for a while and praying for God to send others your way who share your same passion for a more biblical kind of church experience. But if you've already left or you know you're about to leave, let me give you some advice. Don't let finding genuine church community become your focus. Just as the Great Commission was all about focusing on Christ and letting church community grow naturally out of that focus, we must do the same. After all, Jesus has already promised us,
Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be given to you as well.
God already knows your desire for genuine Christian community. In fact, he's the one who put that desire in you. He actually created you for community. So how could all these things he's promised you not include Christian community? However, the Lord is the one who must build that community, just like he's done from the very beginning of the church. Which means you may need to be willing to start small instead of waiting for some fully formed Christian community to come and find you. Simply ask God for a friend. After all, the only thing that's required to start living out the one another's is one other. That's not to say the Lord won't add more believers over time, but we shouldn't despise the day of small beginnings.
For wherever 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them.
And if we're experiencing true community with at least one other believer and with Christ himself, then how are we not experiencing church? And that's really the whole point of this book, because millions of believers are already leaving the institutional church. So it's really just a matter of how you intend to respond. Will you treat these brothers and sisters as if they're disobeying God, simply because they don't go to church anymore? Or instead of assuming all these believers are falling away from the church, is it possible a portion of the church is simply leaving the building?